So, when it comes to depictions of Jesus, there are a lot out there. There's the more modern films like The Passion or The Chosen, or there's the absolute myriad of paintings from the Renaissance period. You can get sick of looking at them in the art galleries, there's so many of them. But we obviously don't have any true paintings of Jesus himself, despite him being probably the most painted figure in history, I would guess. But one of the earliest depictions that we have of Jesus is not particularly flattering. Certainly not like the handsome man with a well-kept beard that we have on the slides behind me. It's an artifact called the Alexamenos graffito. So you can see it up there. It's a plaster etching that was carved onto a plaster wall in Rome sometime around the 3rd century. So you can see on the right side, there is the traced outline of what's being carved into the plaster. And it's hard to read from the actual image, but the translated text of what's being scrawled underneath that picture translates to Alexamenos worships his God. And so you can see from the depiction there, it looks like there's a man on the left, Alexamenos, presumably worshipping a man on a cross with a donkey for a head. So the point of this graffito isn't like most depictions of Jesus. It's not a point for reflection or honoring him. It's to mock Alexamenos for his Christian belief. In fact, the Italian name for this artwork translates to the blasphemous graffito. Because it is plainly because as it would be plain to a Roman, the idea of a crucified God is ridiculous. Probably more ridiculous than a donkey-headed God. The donkey head is probably a misunderstanding of some sort, possibly mixing up something with the triumphal entry, along with rumors that Christians and Jews worshipped a donkey for some reason. But being crucified there is the ultimate humiliation that would plainly be obvious to anyone who had ever seen a crucifixion. So why would anyone worship a God crucified? Surely a God that weak would not be worth worshipping. Now, surely that would be embarrassing to Alexamenos, wouldn't it? But as we're coming back to our series on the book of Mark, we've now reached the crucifixion itself, the climax of the Gospels, and the climax of the mocking of Jesus. So to set the stage before we read the stuff that came beforehand, so we're going to be reading Mark 15. But in Mark, this passage comes after the Jewish leaders have held their trial of Jesus and found him guilty of blasphemy, condemning him as worthy of death. They've then beat Jesus and brought him to Pilate, who was the one who had the power to put people to death. Pilate listens to their charges, and Jesus is silent to them, aside from the response of, "You've said so," when Pilate asks the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate then brings Jesus out before the crowd and gives the crowd the opportunity to choose. He will set either Barabbas, a murderer put in prison for insurrection, or Jesus. They get to choose which one of these gets set free. The crowd chooses Barabbas and calls for Jesus to be crucified. And so, Pilate delivers him, which is where our passage starts. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself. In the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law mocked him amongst themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross, that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Now, our focus today is on the humiliation and mocking of Jesus. Indeed, if your Bible has headers, it probably starts this section called Jesus is Mocked. And he is broadly mocked by the Romans, the crowds, the leaders, and the criminals. And I want to draw out 3 points on the passage today as we reflect on the mockery. They're the humiliation of Jesus, the humiliation of the people, and our humiliation. The first and most obvious point is the humiliation of Jesus. The passage that we've looked at points out the many different ways that Jesus was mocked on the way to the crucifixion. And it's not surprising, given that humiliation and shame were the point of crucifixion. If the Romans wanted to kill somebody, the sword is far more efficient. But the point of the crucifixion was to humiliate and erase the person, to string them up as an example and a deterrent to anyone contemplating a similar act to those who were crucified. It was deliberately a spectacle. In the case of Jesus, the process begins by him being dressed up as a king and beaten by the soldiers. Now a bloody pulp, he's then paraded through the streets carrying the crossbeam of the cross, evidently beaten so badly that they needed to grab someone off the side of the road to carry it for him. He's on parade where everyone can see him and knows what is going to happen. He's then stripped naked and crucified, raised up high so everyone passing by can see him, while he gasps for breath. And everyone passing by can, and indeed do, mock him. It was in many ways the Romans' way of inflicting a fate worse than death upon someone while still killing them. It was the ultimate shame. In an honor-shame culture, it was designed to be maximally humiliating. It was so bad that Roman citizens were not allowed to be crucified. It was deemed as below them, only to be carried out on their subjects and their slaves. But it's not the technical details of the crucifixion that Mark emphasizes in his passage. He's emphasizing the mocking of Jesus, which is always mocking Jesus' lack of power in this situation. The irony, given his great claims and his apparent helplessness to the indignities that he's suffering. Look at how the guards are mocking. They're mocking Jesus as a king. They've dressed him up in royal robes and a crown, but he's a king with no power and one completely subject to their brutality. And he's clothed in a twisted imitation of a king's garment with a crown of thorns instead of gold. And look at how the passers-by mock him. So you're going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days? Come down from the cross and save yourself. They're mocking Jesus' lack of power compared to the greatness of his claims when he was teaching. How could he possibly do such great deeds that he claimed if he can't even prevent himself from being reduced to a strung-up, battered pulp? The leaders as well mock him in the same way. He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross, that we may see and believe. They're taking all Jesus' big claims and powerful works, and then they're using them to mock him. How could any of them be true? How can you be a king if we're beating you to a pulp? If you are the blessed Messiah, the chosen one of God that you claim to be, how come you're hanging up there? And as they mock, they're looking down on Jesus, seemingly helpless and submissive in the face of their mockery. A massive step down from the magnitude of their claims. But here, at the cross, we see the heart of Jesus. In the very topic of the mocking himself, the leaders are mocking that he saved others, but he can't save himself. I mentioned the irony of this last week, that he was saving others by not saving himself. But he also came from far greater than they're mocking him about. He wasn't just King of the Jews, as the sign said. He was the God of the Jews. And yet he gave that greatness up voluntarily. Paul talks about the extent of this humility in Philippians 2. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but rather he made himself nothing, taking on the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself, becoming obedient, even to death on a cross. He willingly gave up his glory and humbled himself and was made nothing. He'd already stepped down from infinite glory to be made a man. Stepping down to the humiliation of the cross was only stepping down a little bit further. But why did he do it? Why did he undergo all that humiliation? He did it for us and for them. He did it to show his love for us in all that he went through. This humiliation of Jesus shows us the character of Jesus in a way that is not seen in any other faith. In other religions, to show the favor of the gods towards a people, it is in blessings, in visions, in prosperity. But in Christianity, it shows the love of God not in those things. To an extent it does, but that is not its peak. Its peak of God's love for us is shown in him himself coming and being voluntarily humiliated and executed for us. That is how we know that God cares and loves us, not just in our personal circumstances. And because of this, Jesus is willingly suffering the mocking and beating of the guards, the mocking of the crowds, the mocking of the rulers, even the mocking of the criminals who are being crucified next to him. But why are all these people mocking him? The guards and the rulers, the mocking is easy to understand. They are the ones in power, and they are exerting that power to see Jesus brought down. But one of the questions that I've always had about the crucifixion is the incredible swing in the attitude of the crowds. How is there such a complete turnaround from the crowds on Palm Sunday, where they're calling him the Son of David, to just immediately before our passage today, where they're calling crucify him? But as I was preparing for this sermon, I came across what I think is one of the better explanations for this backflip. There are many explanations, but this explanation revolves around the fact that Jesus' crucifixion wasn't just humiliating for him. It was also a humiliation for the Jewish people. Sorry, my title's not working. But from the moment that Pilate enters the narrative in the book of Mark, it is always as an insult to the Jewish people, a reminder to them that they are under the thumb of the Romans. The very fact that the Jewish leaders condemned Jesus to death was a humiliation, because they then needed to go to Pilate to ask him to do it. And then Pilate comes along and declares that Jesus is innocent of anything that is guilty of punishment by death. That's an insult to their court and their authority. The Jewish leaders demand death, but the Roman law doesn't actually care. And then Pilate goes and insists that Jesus be called King of the Jews. That's how he addresses him during his confrontation with the crowd and Barabbas. It's always the King of the Jews. His setup with Barabbas is a win-win for Pilate. On one hand, if the crowd requests the release of Jesus the innocent, then it's a blow against the authority of the Jewish council. A man that they have condemned to death walks free, undercutting their authority. But on the other hand, as happened, he now has the people calling for the death of their own king. Pilate is using this title both to reflect the true charges against Jesus, but also to antagonize the Jewish people. Pilate extends this mocking out to the soldiers to the mocking of the soldiers as well, in royal dress, and in the sign that he puts above Jesus on the cross, stating, "The King of the Jews." In the book of John, the chief priests come to Pilate and complain and say, "Put, this man said, I am the King of the Jews," instead, but he refuses. This execution is a power play by Pilate humiliating the Jewish people. Now, it's not the first time he's antagonized them more than necessary. We know from two historians, the Jewish Josephus and the Alexandrian Philo, that there was another incident where Pilate deliberately brought in statues and images of Caesar into the city under the cover of darkness, as a blatant violation of the Jewish law against graven images. A massive provocation against the Jewish people. And then he refused to remove them without a great protest by the people. Philo, the historian, described Pilate's government as being featured by his corruption, his acts of insolence, his plundering, his habit of insulting people, his cruelty, his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending and gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. And that's the Roman view of what happened, not the Jewish one. Pilate wasn't a concerned ruler forced by the crowd to make a judgment against his will. He saw that this was also another opportunity to ridicule the Jewish people, as was his habit, and as was his practice of execution without condemnation. Jesus may just have been one more victim to him. But the Jewish rulers set up Jesus' claim to be king as the way to motivate Pilate to execute Jesus. And Pilate is more than happy to extend that theme to the whole spectacle. But if this is their king, if Jesus is the King of the Jews, then they are Jesus' subjects. And subjects are below a king. If he is their king, he represents them. What is done to them, to him, is symbolically being done to them. For them to be the subjects of the humiliated king is to be below Jesus, to be below the guy humiliated and strung up on a cross. For them to accept him is to accept onto themselves the humiliation Rome was heaping on him. It's far easier for them to mock, to push down and separate themselves from that dishonor. Pilate is trying to associate all the Jewish people with the dishonor he is heaping on Jesus. And so it's understandable that their reaction is to push away that association, to reject Jesus and so by reject the humiliation. And that does, to a certain extent, explain the outcome of the Barabbas incident. Pilate brings out these two men to them. Jesus, who's already been beaten by the Jewish authorities, and says, "Is this the one you want to release? Is this the King of the Jews?" He was the one they were celebrating a week ago on Palm Sunday, in their anticipation that he would be the one to drive out the Romans. This was their moment of glory. He was the strong man who was going to drive them out. For many, that was the vision of the leader that they wanted. But now here he is, weak and beaten. He hasn't even put up any sort of a fight against the Romans. Indeed, he didn't even get arrested by the Romans. He was arrested by the Jewish authorities themselves. The Romans didn't even need to try to put down his rebellion. Do the people still want to follow him, beaten to a pulp and not even protesting verbally? Will they take the shame of the beaten man being their king? Surely it would be far better to take the strong Barabbas. At least he fought in an insurrection, instead of this weak submission that Jesus has. Is that the same attitude that we can have in our hearts? Don't we want a strong hero, a confident hero, or do we want a weak, submissive ruler? The current political campaigning would definitely suggest not. But how do we accept the dishonor that comes from following a crucified man? Our culture may have been significantly shaped by Christian values, but the natural preference to strength is easy and obvious to see. Just look at any of the big box office movies with a hero. Any of the Marvel ones, Gladiator, Die Hard, any video games. There might be some sort of tragedy forced upon the hero, but they'll fight back through their strength, intelligence, cunning, or just sheer force of will. Those are the heroes that you see in the cinema. But that's not the Jesus that we embrace. We see the resurrection at the end, but to get there is following the one who voluntarily let himself be humiliated and killed. When Jesus was calling his disciples, he did not call them to take up their sword and follow him. He called them to take up their cross and follow him. His call is not the call of strength, to be the hero, to stand up, conquer, and take back Judea. It is to take up the humiliation and scorn and go to death. But how can we do that? Well, we'll need to look elsewhere, to go back a few chapters to look at how humiliation as Jesus' followers. I think the best place to start looking at this is before the Last Supper, before Jesus' arrest, to look at Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Before the Jewish leaders or Pilate or the crowds humiliate Jesus, he does it himself. He goes, he strips off his outer garments and takes on the job of the lowest servant in the house, washing filth off people's feet. He does this knowing, as it says in John 13:3, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he'd come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing and wrapped the towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Jesus knew his greatness, and yet knowing that, he took the lowest position. The greatest, coming from and going back to God, so he takes on the lowest job in the house. For the disciples, this was actually an act of humiliation for them. In the Jewish culture, a disciple or a student was always below their teacher. This is one of the reasons that Peter makes such a fuss about Jesus washing his feet, because it puts him below the person washing feet. But he didn't leave it there. Jesus then exhorts the disciples to do the same. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master. The call of Jesus' followers is to humility, not waiting for people to humiliate them, to lower them and then accept it, but to willingly take on the low positions themselves. But Jesus' call is not just for humility and service, love and care for others. To look back even further to the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, I'll read the final one out. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil things against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Jesus is telling his disciples that they are going to be insulted, reviled, and have false things said against them, such as the whole donkey worship thing. But the reviling and humiliation were expected part of the package in the first century church. But if the way of Jesus is humility and humiliation, how can we handle it? How can we handle the shame? How do we stop clinging tightly onto strength to defend our honor? How can we willingly accept insult without retaliation? Do we just have to toughen up and take it? No. The answer, ironically, comes from the humiliation of Jesus himself. When Jesus goes to wash his disciples' feet, he does so knowing that he comes from God and was going back to God. Jesus knows his value before the Father. He knows his high place. And because of that security, he can take the lowly place. In going to the cross, he takes all the humiliation, shame, and guilt, but he does that for us, to save us, to bring us back to himself. He went and did that for us. And that is where we can find our anchor to our value. When our value is anchored to what Jesus, the High One, did for us, in the love of the highest towards us, then any other insults or humiliation lose their strength because they can't touch where our deepest value lies. Any shame of the past, of things where we've done or have been done to us, they all fall away relative to the honor that Jesus himself places on us. At the cross, we have the high allowing himself to be made low out of love for us. And that is what provides us with security. When we see that and get our value from that relationship, that the highest made himself low for us, that is what gives us the anchor to our worth. We don't need to find our worth in other things. And that is how we can bear that humiliation. We don't need to fight for our honor because we've been far more honored than we can even imagine. The pain and humiliation of mockery is the lowering of our status in front of others. But when our status is anchored in Christ's love for us, then we can willingly lower ourselves without the threat of loss of status being anywhere near as great. And it's that love that takes the 12 disciples who are currently fleeing from the garden to boldly later, after the resurrection, proclaim to all Jerusalem and to all regions in which they've spread, telling of the good news of a God who humbled himself, came down, let himself be mocked, humiliated, and crucified, all to bring them and us to himself. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, I thank you that you came and for what you came and did for us on the cross, for giving up your glory and being made like us, and then taking on the mocking, scorn, and shame of the cross so that you could bring us into a relationship with you. Thank you for doing that for us and for being willing, and help us to be willing to humble ourselves as we follow you.